Let's turn it around this way so you can see the board. With a big fat glare on the board. So imagine that these X's represent feeding rates for baby coots. Each X is a feeding rate for a particular baby coot. And what the researchers were interested in is not the feeding rates of individual baby coots, but kind of what the aggregate feeding rate is for orange baby coots and black baby coots in these different treatments that they put in there. But they can't measure all of the feeding rates of all the baby coots that are out there in the world. So what they do is they sample from this population. So these X's represent the population of feeding rates of baby coots. And then you sample, in this case, 5 baby coots out of that big population, in the hopes that that sample mean, that average value for feeding rate, tells you something about the population mean feeding rate. It's not going to tell you everything there is to know about the population mean. It's going to be off somewhat, just like your card draws were off of the population mean for the deck of cards. The feeding rate, the average feeding rate, is an estimate of the population mean, although it's an imperfect estimate because we don't have the entire population measured. The sample mean comes from a distribution of sample means. So we could go back to the baby coot population. We could randomly sample it again with 5 more coots. Where's the one that I missed? There's the one that I missed. This would then be X6, X7, X8, X9, and X10. And we could calculate another sample mean. That's another sample mean that is drawn from this population of sample means, this distribution of sample means. And we could do that 1,000 times, and we would have 1,000 values of a sample mean. Each sample mean is going to be somewhat different because when we go and randomly sample this population, the sample mean is going to bounce around a little bit. But the beauty of the central limit theorem is basically says that if we sample this population over and over and over and over again, we get a distribution of sample means. Because we're sampling sample means, because we're making a distribution of sample means, that distribution will be normally distributed, and the average of that distribution of sample means is going to be what? Go back to our cards. When we had very few samples, this is 2 cards, sampling 2 cards out of this deck of infinite numbers of cards. The average here was a little below 7, so it wasn't the population mean. What happens as we get more and more cards in our samples? It converges on the population mean, doesn't it? This is a distribution of sample means. We went to this population, we sampled 20 cards per sample, we sampled it 1,000 times. It gave us a normal distribution of sample means, and that normal distribution is centered on the population mean. Were the original data a normal distribution? No, the original data are a uniform distribution. 4 1s, 4 2s, 4 3s, 4 4s, 4 5s, 4 6s, 4 7s, 4 8s, 4 9s, 4 10s, 4 11s. Well, that's a jack. 4 queens, 4 kings. It's a uniform distribution, but when we sample it, calculate the means of those samples, it doesn't give us a uniform distribution. It gives us a normal distribution. It's one of the most magical things in science, that you can sample any shaped population, and if you're getting a distribution of the sample means, that distribution of sample means will be normally distributed, and the average of that distribution of sample means will converge on the population mean. Now, how wide that distribution is depends on how many items are in your samples. If it's 2 or 5, that distribution is really broad. If it's 30, that distribution narrows up. So you begin to hone in tighter and tighter on the population mean. So when we do statistics, we're oftentimes interested in comparing one mean to another mean. We're not really interested in the population mean in most cases, but we're interested in how one mean compares to another mean. How do black chicks compare to orange chicks? We don't really care what the true population mean is. We care how these two groups compare to one another. Well, we can calculate a confidence interval around the sample mean that we draw. And we can calculate a 95% confidence interval. And we calculate a 95% confidence interval. What that confidence interval tells us is how to go about this best. It tells us two things. It tells us where the mean is, and it gives us an upper bound and a lower bound when we calculate it. So you've calculated, you've done the math on it in the homework, so I'm not going to reiterate all of that. You calculate the mean, then you find the variance, then you find the standard deviation, then you find the standard error, then you find a t-statistic based on what your sample size is, you multiply that times standard error, you add that to the mean, and you subtract that to the mean, and it gives you this range. So the way to interpret this range is twofold. One way of interpreting it, and this is probably the way, well, who knows what a 95% confidence interval is from high school? What would your definition be?
I'm trying to recall. It's been
Okay, yeah.
Like we're 95% confident.
So what's in there? No, that goes into calculating the confidence interval. Trevor.
You're fully correct answer. The actual answer is in between the low bound and the high bound.
What's the actual answer, though? Like, what is that when you say the actual answer?
Let's see what.
So one thing that you're trying to estimate is what? Yeah.
Is it the population mean?
Okay, so one way of thinking about this is that there's a 95% chance that the population mean, which we use a little lowercase mu, is within this bound, within this region, between this upper limit and this lower limit. But once again, that's not a terribly useful thing to think about because we're not interested in the population mean. We're interested in other means. Does one mean compare to another mean? Are they similar or not? So a different way of thinking about the 95% confidence interval is that 95% of all sample means drawn from this population I cannot spell today for whatever reason. Okay, it's like every day. So if you go to this population of baby coots and look at their feeding rate, and you draw out 1,000 averages of baby coot feeding rates, 950 of them will fall within this range if you've calculated a 95% confidence interval. 25 of them will be out here, and 25 of them will be out here. Now, if we have another mean, let's say that this was the population of orange coots. And now if we have another mean, this is the mean feeding rate for black coots, and it falls over here, we know that the chances are very high that this average feeding rate didn't come from this population, the orange coot population, because it falls outside that bound. It's statistically unlikely that we drew this mean from this distribution of sample means. If this was feeding rate of coots, this would be the distribution of sample means from the orange coots. If there is a mean that falls out here somewhere, or even if there's a mean that falls here, it's outside 95% of the observations of sample means drawn from the orange coots, and as a result, we would say that it's unlikely that it came from that population. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do, is to tell if two means came from the same population or if two means came from two different populations. And so this is unfortunately how most people teach a 95% confidence interval, but I don't find it particularly helpful in doing statistics in the real world. And so I would prefer that you think of it in this way because it's just what you are normally trying to do. Does that make sense? Okay. You were asked to do some calculations on finch beaks. So we're going to be talking about finches for the next how many weeks?
During next week, it'll be, at least 2.
Yeah, many weeks we're going to be talking about finches. We're going to be talking about their beak morphology. And so I gave you a sample of 5 finch beak measurements to average and calculate 95% confidence intervals. This is what the distribution looks like if you make a histogram. It's a cruddy looking histogram because there's only 5 observations. This is from Academy Bay. This is from El Garapatero. This is when you look at both of them together, Academy Bay and El Garapatero. And when you look at this and you calculate the 95% confidence intervals, you should have come up with something like this. This is the mean for El Garapatero. This is the mean for Academy Bay. These are 95% confidence intervals. And the way you test visually, intuitively, to see if these two means are different is you ask, could this mean have come from this means population? And could this mean come from this means population? In the chief shirt. What's your name? Claire. Could they have come from the same population? No, because if this mean came from this population, you would expect its mean to be somewhere within this 95% confidence interval. It falls outside of that. Same thing, vice versa. So that's intuitively how you do it. And that's why I would, once again, prefer you to think of 95% confidence intervals in this way. I only gave you 5 finches. Does that give you a very good idea of what beak morphology is for Darwin's finches? No, it doesn't. I didn't select them, pick and choose. I just picked 5 random out of a larger data set of 63 finches for Academy Bay and a data set of 70 finches for El Garapatero. The 63 finches and the 70 finches is still a sample of this bigger population, but it's a much bigger sample than a sample of 5 finches. When we plot those, guess what happens? This is what those distributions look like. And when you calculate the confidence intervals, you now see that the means are much closer together and they fall within one another's confidence intervals. Now you might think that, oh, those confidence intervals are way bigger, but it's because I haven't standardized my y-axis. If we put these two side by side, this is with 5 finches, this is with all the finches, 63 finches and 70 finches. And what you see is that when we sampled only 5 finches from Academy Bay, we happened to randomly select 5 finches that were relatively small. When we had a fuller sample, it included more of the larger finches, the means got closer together, but the confidence intervals also got smaller. Because with 63 and 70 finches, we have a clearer idea of what the average size of a beak finch is. And we can see they actually are not different at all in these two populations. Incomplete picture, more complete picture and it gives you closer to what probably the right answer is. So a little brief recap. Why do we need to run statistics on samples? Why do we do things like calculating a 95% confidence interval and things like this? Yeah.
Be able to compare samples and also like experiments.
So we need to compare samples to one another. We need to compare sample means to one another, and we need to have some idea of how much uncertainty there is about those estimates of the sample mean. And so anytime you're collecting samples, there's a certain amount of uncertainty as to what the actual real answer is. The only way to get the real answer is to sample the entire population, which we seldom have the ability to do. Why is reporting and graphing 95% confidence intervals better than doing something like standard deviations and stuff like that? Yeah, Emma.
You have more of an idea of the range that it's coming from.
Well, all of these are going to be ranges. The standard deviation is a range, a confidence interval is a range, the variance is a range. Why this range rather than a standard deviation range? Trevor.
It's a visual representation that you can see if they coincide with each other.
Yeah, it's what we refer to as inferential. You can make the decision on whether or not two means are different based on that 95% confidence interval, generally speaking. And so you can look at the data visually and say, oh, those things look different or those things don't look different. And so you don't have to do a lot of mental math during somebody's presentation to try and figure out if the difference they're showing you is real or not. Why are larger samples more useful than smaller samples? Gives you a clearer picture of the thing that you're trying to learn something about with larger samples compared to smaller samples. Do you guys feel confident that you could calculate 95% confidence intervals with a given set of data? All right, I'm seeing some shakes of the head. Okay. If you're still having problems with that, what should you do?
Talk to you.
Talk to me, talk to Dr. Judd. We both know how to do this. Either of us can help you work through that. If you had trouble on your homework, once again, it was preparatory homework, so it's really only worth 5 points. And it doesn't matter if you got it right on that or not. But if you had difficulties with it, you need to come and talk to us about how to go through those calculations so we can make sure that you know how to do that. So as always, come and talk to one of us if you need help on that. And I am done, and Dr. Judd has a plan for you. Any questions? Okay, these are the base fundamentals of statistical theory, how samples relate to populations, how samples relate to decision making in statistics. Once you have those down, a lot of other things in statistics just become easier to you. So make sure that you understand these fundamental basics so that you can understand things that we will talk about later on. Dr. Judd, take it away.
So you all have word files and contact names. Trying to get those in.
Trevor and Clara. I'm keeping notes. Are you guys both in? You guys are both in the same group. Kicking ass, taking names. Awesome.
So we're going to be doing some group stuff today, but I want to start by just getting us into just briefly go over this. So you've spent the last few days working on statistics and thinking about a scientific paper on Kuntz with Dr. Kowinski, with Paul, and now we're going to do a similar activity with a different paper, giving you a different approach to a different scientific paper. So our goals for all this stuff is we're going to get you guys learning some terminology, learning some of the language, which hopefully you saw that at the beginning today. Eventually we're going to go through designing an experiment. You're going to learn how to write a lab report in lab, and in the lecture portion, you're going to learn how to summarize literature. And that's what we're kind of preparing you to do, because we're going to have several literature summaries. First one will be on these finch beaks. We're going to be interpreting graphs and figures, and we're going to, so this is the one I just said, and we're going to be distinguishing between approximate and ultimate answers. So today we're going to work on an approach to this paper. So you should have your word clouds. What were your top 5 largest words? What did you guys get? I noticed, back here.
Selection.
Selection, right? So a lot of you got selection. Anybody get anything weird, something other than selection? What other big words did you get? Yeah.
Lizards.
Lizards, good. Yep.
Squamosal.
Squamosal. Mm-hmm. Squamosal, that's good. Yep. Another one?
My biggest word was
Horned. Oh, horned. Okay. Yeah. Anybody else?
Evolutionary.
Yeah. Evolutionary? Okay.
Evolutionary.
Yeah. Yep.
Predation.
Predation. Yep.
Selection.
Yeah. Selection again. Okay. So I noticed this late last night when someone sent me a word cloud via email who wasn't going to be here today. There's some settings on this particular word cloud website that I didn't know about. The first time I tested it, everything worked perfectly fine. But then later I learned that there are some settings that are kind of apparently randomized. So what happened for some of you, if you didn't get a word like selection as your biggest one, is it only took the first 100 words out of the whole paper or something like that. I don't know why it worked fine for me and then didn't for some others. But the point of a word cloud is that the relative size of the different words represents their frequency in the paper. So if you only got a subset of the paper, you got a poor representation of the distribution of words in the paper, which it should sound familiar. We were just talking about the effective sample size. If you make a word cloud using the entire population of words in the paper, it should look something like this. So this will make the next part, the discussion, a little bit more interesting, maybe a little more dynamic within your groups. So what I want you guys to do is, now that we talked about the word clouds, share in your group your concept map. What do you think the paper is about? What do you think the narrative or the study, the investigation was that's communicated in this paper? And you can share, instead of just walking people through it, which you can do, you can also talk about how you came up with it based on your concept map. Once you've all shared, once you've gone around your little circle, then see if you can come up with a synthetic group concept map of what you think the paper was about. All right, around the groups.
Very
Probably horned lizards and how they
Yeah.
I feel like maybe it's just like a test on
how horned lizards groups and protect themselves from
Because I would assume no
predators.
one has horned lizards. Yeah, that just makes sense. And the length is also a big thing. And then also like different so like length of the horn and their selection.
What can we It must be that the program is.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay, so it's taking some
For
other.
years, it's less.
The word really gets stories. You even have one. So I have one. You don't even have one. But the big ones are.
I like a mini triangle, and then you also put that at the bottom.
Old word comprehension for years.
I copied and pasted one generator, alright? That's all I did.
No, it's not your fault. Oh, that's yeah. Yeah, you're right, it does say concept.
Yeah, but one of the things says it's like when we come up as a collective.
Should we start right here?
Yeah.
Do we also turn our collective?
I'll collect the individual ones, but I want you each to have the collective.
What about like the Dropbox on Google? Is that what it's for?
Do I have a term there? Oh, sorry, I left the Dropbox from last year when we were all on road. So you can just turn these in.
And don't worry about Dropbox.
Under mine.
You guys don't do like one
I hadn't planned on it, I thought you guys had been in, but there is a dropout on Moodle, so go ahead and use it this time.
Okay, so the flowchart and the word cloud, can I pick up that?
Yeah, just put them both in, that'll be fine this time. I'll check on Moodle. For this case, yes, but I didn't do it.
You guys are very quiet.
I don't know what my generator is, but it did something in
Yeah, it's a subset, it's just the first, like, first part of the paper, because the stories is in there.
With all of your ideas.
Just so, that's how I know it's the first part, because those are big.
Think about
So you're about a third of the way through the paper. And that, I don't know why I did that, I did it randomly because but it's good, we're happy to.
Mine might not look like any of your individual ones, but it actually might be kind of different once you talk. So let me see your copy. So so who's where do you select your copy?
I think you wanted, but you did say you wanted to see the better.
You probably have your handwriting, right? Sorry, my handwriting's a little.
Okay, my
Make
name
sure
is
it was an electronic copy.
who's the trader? Okay. Oh, you're not supposed to look at mine.
Well, it was on the slide, I was trying to find a big.
That's my work.
Well, I did it, you know, mine's not like that, so I don't know this like.
Yeah, I don't remember how you did that.
I didn't understand the colors, like, I didn't know you didn't make margin colors.
Yeah, I did that in 2015, so I don't remember. Was it colored in black? Oh, probably because of that.
I didn't take mine like.
Yeah, because there's some things that aren't in the paper actually that I put in mine. So don't worry, that's why I don't want you to look at it.
I didn't know, cause like, I made mine like that, like, or I had a center thing that broke off, I didn't make mine in this, so I didn't know.
So when you're doing this, you should try and put together causal connections. So try and figure out who's the predator, who's the prey. Is the paper about something about the predator, or is it about something about the prey? Et cetera, et cetera. So do all that together. I forgot to try.
So you bring
I'll bring a word lizard. I got it. You get it? Okay.
It could be length of the horn.
Like natural selection. We have natural selection.
I'm pretty sure it'd be natural selection.
Yeah, so it shows us
natural selection would have made the, and Liz branches it off of one, and we go to subcategory of that, and then whatever the other thing is, go off of that. The only thing I can remember is for A&P, it's like a selling machine.
Temporal bone, especially when the separate bone, which is in mammals, it's in the lower jaw.
I think the lizards have the horns and the stripes and the wings. I think the lizards got the horns and the stripes and the wings.
Leads to causes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, but like, you know, this basically what happened. Not with us now. So it constantly updates and like updates. And now it's like starting to
Is there barbs? Barbed horn.
I don't know. Mine has longer head.
That might be quicker. Yeah. Seems like a good idea. Well, see if you can just stop in and check with the gold store meetings this afternoon. Another one is if you need it or something. I now have a schedule. So you can use that. We'll get it straightened out. You still have our problems on Tuesday. Stop.
Probably.
I just want to, but I want you to have a copy of your group.
We all need to have a copy.
We all need to have a copy of everybody. One is the group.
Each one has to have their own. And I mean, that's a great idea.
Or it's not right now. There's a, I can delete we'll predict. Yes, I want it.
Okay. So I don't have anything that's on there online?
Okay. So now that you've all created a group concept map, which looks pretty good for most of you, just one reminder that when you're making these concept maps, I was saying this to most of you already, labeling the links can help you read the concept map later. So if you've got horn length and predation or something like that, you might say leads to or prevents or causes. These kind of linking words can help you tell the narrative of the concept map later when you're looking at it 2 or 3 days.
There's a program called CMap Tools that explicitly lets you do that. And at times it's a pain because you don't really have a linking word that you want in there, but it always leaves you a little box for it. It's free. It's another education developed concept mapping program.
In the interest of time, and because I walked around and looked at each of you as you were creating these, what I'd like you to do now is go on the Moodle on your iPad or your computer, go to the folder for today, and download the Young et al. Paper, the natural selection paper. A little clarification here, you're going to see us use this phrase, et al., quite a bit. Et al. Means and others, or and colleagues. So Young, Brody, and Brody were the three authors of this paper. But in order to not have to say that every time, and especially not to write it every time, we just use the Latin and colleagues here. So Young et al. Is how we refer to a paper, so I have to say all the authors or the whole title every single time. So you should be able to find the Young et al. Paper for today, for September 3rd. Anybody having any trouble finding that? There should only be a couple files in there. Yeah, good. It's got the big blue Brevia. So take about 8-10 minutes. It's a short paper, and read that. That's the next one. You can read the actual. You're in my notes.
I'm reading the actual article, has photos in it, which will be useful to you.
Yep. Young Horned Lizard Science 2004 in the September 3rd material folder.
Yeah, that's the text file. You need the actual paper.
Yeah. So a couple of you are reading the text file, but you'll want the paper in this page. So go back. This was in the folder for yesterday. Scroll on. So go to the September 3rd after this. Yeah, the third. Anybody else having any trouble finding it? Well, I'm going to be quiet so you can concentrate.
We're going to see the Outback shopping today.
Oh, really?
Far enough along with the build that it's time to start thinking about actually towing the thing. Spelling in notes. Just like these kinds of papers that came out when I first started. I have old lab related stuff.
Yeah,
It's
I have
on
two.
on the Dropbox.
And I saw you
I didn't know
actually
you-
in 2017. He did it more for other classes.
Okay.
There were some things that I remember having that I found, so I'm making this.
All right. So what happened to your computer? Getting a new computer was a little disruptive. Hmm?
It's kind of fun.
Oh, yeah. It's, well, and we also have a test rule to compare to, so. Yeah, my Texas one was just way too big. It's like a thing that's a tchotchke that my mom got me when she was traveling once.
Big friend of mine has two. Two of them. Which one? And I found that.
So I have a bronze one, but it's much smaller and it's more hardy. It's exactly like bronze paperweight. And I have this other one that like my mom got at a national club or something, and it's just way too big.
I'm just going around. So most of you are getting to the end now. When you're done reading, compare your understanding of the article with your teammates. Just talk about it for a moment. And then you can start revising the concept map if you want to update or change a connection or something like that. But just make sure you all get it first, and then work together on updating your group concept map.
No, they get longer.
No.
Because the shorter ones.
I don't know.
The longer the ones are, the more
It's so weird that
That sounded like I was playing you, I was not.
Strikes are weird.
Yeah.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
Don't the strikes for the flatheads?
What?
Don't the strikes for the flatheads, or do they read that?
No, flat tail is the,
Okay.
You want to update the flow diagram? How close were you with your original concept map?
It's not very good.
Those are still up to you, too.
They're cool.
You can add another thing to the strikes and put hundreds. Yeah.
one of the words.
Well, but like, you know, they hunt them.
I've seen that somebody had a lizard shaped work cloud.
Yeah.
Is that you? More so. Which is the word.
These predators, man. And
How do you read the paper help?
And how about you guys? Updating it a little bit?
A little bit.
Pretty close? Good. This is a good one for the group concept map where if you can explain a little bit what the links mean. So, how are the strikes involved in natural selection versus the lizards? Even from after reading the paper?
So I think like the stripes, I mean, after selection, the ones with the shorter like horns, they get killed. They're gonna be able to carry on the disease. Selection, the ones with shorter horns.
And who has the horns, the stripes or the lizards?
Lizards.
And so what's the longer? Did beaks show up? Did they do anything with beaks in the paper? Did they measure that? Like that? Was that a variable?
There's longer and huge strikes off the
Yeah. Yeah, so loggerhead strike is the name of the species.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which we'll show you in a second. Okay, good. Well, I think everybody's just about ready. Okay.
So,
Yeah, you were just
All right. Yeah. Okay, so let's come back together now. We're just walking around asking you how you change your concept maps. And do you guys feel in general like your revisions were major or minor? Minor. So by previewing the paper, just looking briefly with the help of a concept map and a word cloud, you were able to get a sense of what it was about before you actually read it. And then getting the details of exactly what they did and why and how it's all related became clearer more quickly than it would have been if you just read the paper cold, right? You had a better idea, you had scaffolding for the information you're about to receive. So that's one of the strategies we're giving you here. Just like answering that outline of questions for the Coot study, here just previewing it and trying to assess what are the important players in this study, and then reading it to figure out how they all relate to each other, is a good way to read a paper. And we're going to be reading a lot of papers in this class, not always with these lead-ins, so these are two strategies you can use to read a paper. Okay, so at the very beginning, well, someone tell me who are the major players, who are the two organisms we're talking about here? Yeah.
Shrikes and the lizards.
Yeah, the logger-headed shrikes and the horned lizards. So we've got the two of them here. Here's a shrike, here's a lizard. We have examples for you to actually see what the organisms are like. A model of the lizard and an actual specimen of the logger-headed shrike. And we're going to
Just lost his ID tag.
Oh no. So we'll talk to you about their biology a little bit, but one of the things that I want to sort of clarify is at the very beginning, they introduce this idea of a just so story. Does anyone know what a just so story is or where that comes from? It comes from the children's stories that go all the way back to 1902. So Kipling was the author of these children's stories, and he would tell stories about why leopards got their spots or something. It was a story about kind of a myth, right? The hunter gave, or the gods gave the leopards the spots so they could hunt and not be seen. The way we use them in the context of evolutionary biology since about the 70s, I think, is this idea that a just so story is a narrative explanation for something that looks like an adaptation, some phenotype, some aspect of an organism, some adaptation, that's based on kind of intuition and it's untested. So in this case, we've got logger-headed shrikes and we've got their prey, the horned lizard. The horned lizard has horns, and you might think, oh, well, maybe the horns are a way of defending against the shrikes. Another example of a just so story would be something like the logic of it would be something like, why do primates like us have fingers and fingernails instead of claws? Well, because maybe it's better to grasp fruits and branches and things with fingers and fingernails than it is with claws. Just say that. Right? That's the just so story. So it's untested. It's a kind of just a story, and it can be about anything really. And the criticism of just so stories came from stories people were telling about why humans do the things we do in evolutionary context, and often the explanations were just sort of various cultural preferences. So there was kind of a backlash against telling these stories about evolution without providing tests for them. So the logger-headed shrikes are unusual among the predators for horned lizards because of one of the ways they hunt, which you can see here. They get their prey items, they'll kill them, and then they'll impale them on a barbed wire fence or a sharp branch of an old tree. And so you can find all kinds of dead lizards if you go looking for dead lizards, if that's what you want to find. When you find them impaled, you know why they died. That's one of the special things about this particular study. And the way they catch them is they tend to go for the neck, right behind the head of the horned lizard. All right, so the paper is about horned lizards and shrikes, but what's the big idea? What's the concept that the paper is about, the biological concept, independent of the lizards and the shrikes?
Natural selection.
Natural selection, right? So what do we mean by natural selection? What is it? You guys have a sense of what natural selection is before I give you a definition and some parts of it? Yeah.
It's kind of like how things die, whether it's like, just like in nature, and like the things that affect them to die.
Yeah, okay, good. So in nature, things that affect survival of organisms, survival is an important component of it, and another important component of it is in nature. So as opposed to people deciding which dogs to breed or not breed, something like that. Anybody else have an idea of what natural selection is? Yeah.
A lot of times it's like, has to do like, it can be like evolutionary too, like over time, like
So there are consequences that are carried out over time, over generations, and they affect how fit or how adapted an organism is to its environment. So natural selection is the primary mechanism of adaptive evolution. So evolution is just change over time within biological populations or species. But natural selection is the primary mechanism by which these populations adapt as a form of change. One way they change is through adaptation. And it was first communicated or first sort of articulated in the scientific community by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, who you'll hear more about when we talk about the Galapagos Islands, back in 1858. One of the goals of evolutionary biologists then, because natural selection is so important, is to document and describe how selection acts in nature. So what I want to do is sort of introduce you to some of the components of evolution by natural selection. And then we'll see if we can link them to the paper. So there are four conditions or preconditions, sort of the same word, I guess, or four tenets of this idea of evolution by natural selection that Darwin articulated in the letter, but then more fully and with a lot more supporting evidence in the book On the Origin of Species a year later. And you can break these down in slightly different ways, but this is the way that I tend to prefer seeing them. I think it makes sense logically. What's great about this is if you're unsure about how evolution by natural selection works, break it down into these four parts. If those four things are happening in the world, we can observe them, we can measure them, then evolution by natural selection is a consequence of these things happening. It happens naturally, it happens logically.
It's also a good way to do this because this is actually the four components that Darwin used. So.
Yeah. So the first one is the overproduction of offspring. The way it's phrased here, overproduction of offspring for each generation, comes from what Darwin was reading at the time about concerns about overpopulation among humans. They thought, oh, there's all these people, we can't feed them all, there's too many people. That's where this language, overproduction of offspring, comes from. What matters here is that there's more offspring that are produced than can possibly survive and reach their full reproductive potential. What's the full reproductive potential of an average human, of a typical human female, do you think? What's the largest number of children you've ever heard of?
8, 19.
Yeah, where'd you hear 19?
19 kids and counting.
Yeah, right. Do all human females reach that full reproductive potential?
No.
Well, they got other things to do, right? So that's fine. This happens. It doesn't mean that we're, in that case, that there's too many people. What matters here is that not all survive and reach their full reproductive potential. Then, with respect to some trait of interest, in this case, what's our trait of interest for the lizards? Or horn length. There's going to be some variation among those individuals for a trait of interest. Then that variation in that trait, horn length in this case, is heritable, meaning it has a genetic basis. You can have things that are similar between parents and their offsprings, not because of a genetic basis, but what matters here is the heritability has a genetic underlying component. And then the fourth one is there must be some sort of differential consequences, right, that are related to that trait of interest. So not all of them are going to reach their full reproductive potential. If this trait that we're interested in, that's heritable, has something to do with which ones reach more or less reproductive potential, which ones survive or don't survive, then you will get adaptation by natural selection, or you get evolution by natural selection, and you might see that manifested as an adaptation. A question? No. Okay. Does this seem okay? So what we want to do is think about how these four relate to what you read in the paper. And let's define a couple terms here. The Duggars. Yeah, there we go. The Duggars. So, sometimes we have words that are used and have slightly different meanings in different contexts. What do you guys think of when you think of adaptation? Someone give me one definition of adaptation. Yeah.
The way organisms change over time to become more fit for their environment.
Okay, good. We're going to define fitness in just a moment. Yep. Someone give me another definition of adaptation. Have you used it any other way in your life? Yeah.
The ability to be able to like change accordingly.
And what might change?
Whether it be like, you mean like human wise?
Yeah, Scott, I was predicting that was what you were thinking anyway.
Whether it be like socially, environmentally, you'll be able to, you know.
Yeah, good. So this is the other way that people tend to use it. This is you guys, right? This idea of an individual acclimating to some new conditions. You might be acclimating to life at Jewel. You might be a mountaineer and you want to do a big hike or a big bike ride in the mountains. You might have to acclimate to that lower oxygen, like football trainers who are going to play in Denver, but they're from East Coast or something. That's not the context we mean here. In this course, we mean is either a process driven by natural selection to maximize the fit or reproductive potential of one who is in an environment, or it might also refer to the trait, the consequence of adaptation. So long horns, we might call an adaptation, and selection for longer horns would be the process of adaptation as driven by the Loggerhead Strikes. Okay? So there's two ways we're going to use it, and we're not going to use the third one, which is the colloquial individual acclimate. Okay, the other term was fitness. What do you guys think we mean by fitness in biology? Or, if that's hard, what do you think we definitely don't mean? Yeah.
Like ability to survive.
Okay, ability to survive and reproduce, right? And what is it then not? What's the, not the converse, but what's an incorrect definition of fitness in this context?
Strength.
Yeah, good. That's a common misconception. So I just wanted to point it out so you know to avoid it. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, yep. You can mix colors. Okay, here. All right. And the last one, which I'll write up there in a moment, is phenotype. Okay, go ahead. What is phenotype? Have you guys learned this word before?
Yeah.
The physical manifestation.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. It's some outward expression of organisms' genetic makeup. Could be a morphology, could be a behavior, could be biochemical. It's some physical or outward expression of organisms. So, I already asked you guys the question of what's the trait of interest here. You said it's the horns, and what are the horns related to?
Defense mechanism?
Yes, as a defense mechanism, but in the context of the figures, the pictures, that one variable is horn length. What's the other variable? Yeah, probability of survival. Is that what you were going to say? Yeah, probability of survival. Now, I made this figure up based on what they had. These are not their data, but I just wanted to show you that they went out and measured live lizards and shrike-killed lizards, the ones that were impaled. And so they got some distribution of horn length for the ones that were shrike-killed, and some distribution of, or some set of values for the living ones. How does the graph look? It doesn't look like this. What does the graph look like? Yeah, it's kind of smooth, right? So one of the variables here is horn length, and we'll talk about residual in just a second. And then there's this status, alive or shrike killed. Oh, there it is, okay. This is what you actually saw. So they're calculating some expected survival based on the distribution of horn lengths in these two groups, the ones that were strike killed and the ones that were dead, or the ones that were alive. Does anyone know what residual horn length means? Any thoughts? So natural selection, let me walk you up to it. Natural selection acts on individuals through their effect on, acts through individuals' phenotypes through their effect on fitness. Right? So the longer your horns, the more likely you are to survive. And if you survive, what else can you do? Reproduce, right? So natural selection operates through the phenotype. Our phenotype of interest is horn length, but what else affects horn length besides traits? Genetics, parents, so that gets at the heritability. What else varies about lizards besides their horn length? Maybe their diet, their size, maybe their diet influences their size, right? How would you expect bigger lizards' horns to be relative to smaller lizards? If we're interested in the ability of these lizards to defend against strikes, or young or then we have to remove the effect of body size. So one way we can do that is to look at horn length. Well, I have it up here. Let me go right here. Is to plot the size of the head and the size of the horns and see if there's a relationship. And if there is, as we expect, larger lizards have longer horns, then we can fit a line to that. We can make a model where if you have some head length, you can predict the horn length. But we want the horn length independent of head size. So they use a residual. What that means here is that what's the difference between an actual observation of a horn length and the predicted given its head size? And that value is the residual. So here we've got an example where a large lizard with kind of medium-large horns is maybe poorly defended, has short horns, whereas an intermediate-sized lizard has larger than you would expect, and so it has longer horns. So these are the values that they use along the axis here. That's why we've got these kind of small numbers, and they're normalized so that 0, this should be a positive 0.8, 0 is the average horn length of a lizard. That's basically along the line is what that 0 means. Okay, so what we want to do is, we'll have to start this on Wednesday, is ask, did the authors, using these data, show those 4 conditions of natural selection? So think about that. Be prepared to wrap that up on Wednesday.